Hello and welcome. My name is Brian Caplen, editor of The Banker. I'm here with Philip Alexander, the senior editor, and we're discussing the issues that are going to be on the agenda at the annual meeting of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the EBRD, in Warsaw in May. And Philip, I mean, a few weeks ago, you know, we were talking about convergence and sort of economic resurgence in Eastern Europe, but then, you know, we've had the situation with the Russian troops going into Crimea and the conflict over that region. Is that going to change the discussion topics in Warsaw?
I think very much so, yes. The EBRD has had a very strong line on this. Even while President Yanukovych was in power, the EBRD was openly talking about cutting back its commitments in Ukraine because of corruption and mismanagement. Since the events that toppled President Yanukovych, the EBRD has pledged to step up its funding quite substantially, potentially doubling it, almost doubling it to about $1 billion a year. And they've spoken up very strongly in favor of supporting political and economic stability in Ukraine, getting it back on its feet, and helping the government there to rebuild and improve governance. There's a big focus on that as well. So they've made it very clear that they want to help stabilize Ukraine. Potentially, obviously, that is going to cause tensions with Russia, who do not support the new government in Kiev.
Okay, now how are things from a practical banking point of view in the Crimea at the moment? I mean, how difficult is it to do normal banking there?
Well, it's becoming increasingly unclear. So the Ukrainian banks that operated in Crimea are in the process of scaling down or pulling out altogether. Privatbank, the country's largest bank, is pretty much shutting down all its branches in Crimea. Raiffeisen Aval, the subsidiary of one of Austria's banks, that's one of the other largest banks in the country, is also scaling back. But as yet, Russian banks haven't really gone in there because they're not sure what the legal status of the region is. They don't want to get caught if subsequently it's handed back to Ukraine. So as a result, banking facilities generally in Crimea are being shut down.
Okay. Now, we might have expected, you know, the discussion at the EBRD to be talking about convergence with the European Union. You've obviously got a number of countries hoping to join. I mean, what's the status of play there with countries and how quickly they're developing towards EU standards?
Well, I think obviously that's a big theme of the meeting, and it's a word that sort of disappeared over the last few years. It was much talked about during the big wave of EU entry in 2004 and 2007. Essentially what's happened is those countries have been a bit knocked off track by the financial crisis. The EBRD played a big part making sure there wasn't a major catastrophe, if you like, in 2008 with funding and efforts to stabilize the region. But what we've seen is a sort of slow leaching away of some of the financing flows from Western Europe, caused, you know, aggravated by the Eurozone crisis, the problem of Greek banks that were quite active in the Balkan regions. So there's a feeling that convergence process has stalled a little bit, and fresh efforts are needed to really get those countries back to levels of growth that will actually bring living standards up towards Western Europe. Poland is perhaps a bit of a poster child. They've done reasonably well through the crisis, but even in Poland now there are concerns that the economy has been slowing a bit, that some sectors are doing well, but some sectors and some parts of the country have been left behind. And in certain other countries, the situation is much more difficult. Countries like Romania that had a big property boom that's then turned into a bust. You know, the banking sectors there are really struggling at the top end, and the economy is struggling as well. So there's a feeling that there's a lot more effort now needed to focus. Now that Europe has sort of got over its own panic over the Eurozone, they need to look east and start focusing again on how to get some of the new and some of the aspiring EU members back on track.
Okay, now the EBRD covers a lot of territory, doesn't it? It takes in Central Asia, it takes in parts of the Middle East.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how much focus will be there on those kinds of regions? I'm thinking particularly of Central Asia. We've written a lot in the magazine about Kazakhstan and these sort of attempts to get its banking performance a bit straightened out.
That's right. I think Central Asia, I mean, some of the countries in Central Asia, the EBRD has really struggled with. There hasn't been much effort at transition. Kazakhstan was making more efforts towards a more market-based economy. They went through a very serious proper real estate boom and bust that really took down a lot of the banking sector after 2008. They are trying to get things back on track, and some of the banks that had to be bailed out by the government are now in the process of being sold back into the private sector. There's still issues there with relatively high rates for non-performing loans, and that's a feature in quite a few countries, also in Central and Eastern Europe, places like Romania, Croatia increasingly. There are a number of countries where there are persistent problems with bad loans. So the EBRD is doing a lot of work figuring out how to deal with that, how to transfer loans to get them off bank balance sheets and allow them to really start lending afresh into the economy to help stimulate it.
Okay, thanks, Philip. So lots of things to discuss there at the EBRD annual meeting in Warsaw, Poland, and the banker, of course, will have its special issue on distribution there.